Welcome to this edition of the SAM Conversations. In this episode, we would be reviewing India-US relations. There has been a fair amount of disruption, to put it mildly, after President Donald Trump has assumed office and entered the White House. Concurrently, there have been a number of other developments, both regional and global, that have contributed to both the turbulence and the uncertainty as far as the bilateral is concerned. Now, India-US is not just about these two democracies. This relationship has a bearing on the regional grid, which is South Asia. And by extension, it also has a bearing on what could best be described as Southern Asia, which allows us to look at the India-US-China, the triangular configuration. To discuss this and perhaps shed some light on some of these, the subtext, if you will, of this bilateral, we have a very good panel. I'm very glad to introduce Ambassador Surendra Kumar. He is the founder president of the Indo-American Friendship Association. It will soon complete 10 years, right, Ambassador? So congratulations.
Thank you.
We also have Dr. Zorawar Daulet Singh. He's been with us in the past. Glad to have you as always, Zorawar. He's a fellow with the Center for Policy Research and a very astute observer, if I may put it that way. I saw your last piece in the EPW.
Okay.
So I hope we can do something with that. And Dr. Tanvi Madan, who is with the Brookings institution in Washington, D.C. She is a senior fellow there. Welcome, Tanvi, to our program. I hope we'll be able to get you again. And congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
India, US, China.
Yes.
So hopefully we'll be able to talk about that. But Zorawar, can I start with you?
Sure.
If we look at India, US, and where are we now, and what are the prospects and challenges, and without making this sound like a trick question, is President Donald Trump coming to India?
Well, we don't know enough about that, but it's possible that he would. And perhaps we could weave that into why he's possibly connecting this with a possibility of some sort of a deal on Afghanistan. I think so. He would like to showcase to the domestic audience that there's some sort of an extrication of Afghanistan, even if it doesn't happen. And India,
And he's keeping his promise, bring the boys
and for
home.
me, India is sort of not the primary part of the visit, but why not showcase this relationship also? So one of the things that sort of stands out in the last few years is, despite all the disruptions we've seen in US foreign policy vis-a-vis so many other partnerships, allies, adversaries, the India sort of sector has been more or less stable. So it's quite remarkable, in fact, that despite all that, and part of this perhaps could be attributed to that both sides, particularly the Indian side, has not let its differences go beyond a certain threshold and shape policy. So we've seen from the Indian side an active amount of engagement and keeping continuity, and I think parts of the US strategic establishment also value this particular relationship, of course, in the larger scheme of things and in South Asia. But the fact remains that, of course, there are these growing, I won't say differences, but the changing international environment has sort of resetting the old rationale for the Indo-US relationship, and it needs to be sort of redefined and reset. At least that's the argument that I've made recently, that perhaps the old sort of one-way kind of smoothness needs to be sort of tempered with a little bit of realism here.
So would it be fair to say, and I'm going to take this to Ambassador Kumar also, that there is an essential continuity from 2008 when we had closed the India-US civilian nuclear agreement to where we are now? So would you agree that there is this continuity in the bilateral?
Yeah, I think there seems to be certainly a political will in both the establishments to keep this ball rolling. But I think they are not getting to that stage where you might need to now reset certain terms of this relationship and where you're going. So it seems to be sort of drifting along, and at some stage you might find yourself, or especially the Indian side, that they're not quite getting what they had properly envisaged.
But let's ask the practitioner. Ambassador Kumar, would you sort of go along with this formulation about the continuity, and what is it about President Trump?
I do agree. There is a bipartisan support in US. Doesn't matter Democratic president or Republican. In India also, whether UPA or you have NDA, the leadership has been wanting having relations with US, the best possible relations, is in India's national interest. And there have been so many statements from USA also, from congressmen, from senators, from the secretary, that good relations with India are larger, broader global interests of US are served by them. Now, I said at my function just 2-3 days back, in spite of the serious differences which we have on economic front, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's a globalization of data or some of the pharmaceuticals, others, in defense, our relations have never been better. If you take overall, I think India-US relations have never been better. And credit should also go to a great extent to the current Prime Minister, because he has dealt with two different styles of president. He had very close personal chemistry with Obama. He enjoyed the same chemistry with Trump. There was nothing in common between the two persons. But basic fundamentals, I think if you take just the last 2 years or less than 2 years of Trump, so many major agreement defense field has been agreed. Whether you use SAT-1 or whether you call it just 2-3 days back, not 2-3 weeks, I think 2+2 dialogue in Washington, when you signed the Industrial Security Annex. These are very major differences. You will have access to their sophisticated technology, you will be treated, even Senate passed resolution saying India should be treated on par with NATO allies of Singapore, Japan, South Korea. So there's a lot of going on. Difference is always there. We have 17 disputes in WTO. But if we take overall picture, I think there's a lot of more convergence than differences.
Can I summarize what you're saying and say that you are bullish, that you see the bilateral as, being on a very positive trajectory? Would that be a fair?
I personally feel that there is no way to see that relations will not go further.
Okay, that's fair.
In a positive way.
Dr. Madan, if I can ask you, two issues here. You sit in Washington, D.C., so I'm sure that the view from there must be very different from perhaps the way when you look at the bilateral from India or from New Delhi. There are two strands here. One is that in recent months, particularly after the August 5 decision by the Indian government in relation to Jammu and Kashmir, and most recently about the Citizenship Amendment Act and so on, there is a mood within the US Congress, particularly amongst the Democrats, which has been critical of India. Do you see that having any bearing? Because some critics have argued that the kind of bipartisan consensus that we had in the US legislature seems to be now impacted in a negative way. So how do you see that in terms of the bilateral itself?
I think, when we talk about the US relationship and whether it's moving forward or not, I always find it useful to break it down into the strategic reasons for the relationship, the economic and the values-based element. And what we've seen over the last, and I would not even say 2008, I would go back to around the late 90s, particularly 2000, is that you've seen each of those kind of essentially be relatively balanced. And so you've had this three-legged stool. And I think what you've seen in the last couple of years, particularly almost 3 years now, that on the defense and security side, actually, this relationship has deepened considerably. Foundational or enabling agreements signed, moving forward operationally, reviving the quadrilateral, talking about the Indo-Pacific and working together. And so you've seen that move forward. Economic, I would say the picture is mixed. As Ambassador Kumar said, if you look at the numbers, they've gone up, both in terms of trade and investment. Private sector companies from the US are still interested in doing business here, and Indian companies interested there. But I think this value side, but on the other hand, on the economic side, trade frictions to a president and a prime minister here who care about this economic issue, and frankly, both have shown protectionist tendencies that have affected their ability to really move forward on trade deal. But it's the value side that I would say definitely here, but also, there have been complaints from India about the US as well, particularly related to immigration, potentially the safety of Indian citizens. But I think on the Hill, what you've seen now on Capitol Hill is that some of those values questions are being raised, either as values per se, that look, part of the reason for the support of India in the US has been it's a democracy. It is part of this kind of rules-based order. Americans often refer to it as the liberal international order, though that's being referred to less and less. And so India is kind of a like-minded partner in that regard. And so there are questions about that. I think on the other side as well, those who don't necessarily care about the value side so much, that these create some space for both countries. They care about it from an internal stability issue. Internal stability, but also the Indian government's ability to focus on the economy. That is this all essentially going to take away or contribute to India being able to be that strong, prosperous India that the US would like to see in Asia, very much as, if not stated, but actually as a counterbalance or contrast to China.
Well, okay, I'll come back to you because I think there is a kind of related issue here, which is, your book really, the China factor and the bilateral. But let me sort of weave this differently. Zorawar, if I could ask you to look at Afghanistan. In your opening remarks, you spoke about President Trump and the primacy that Afghanistan has from his point of view as the person in the White House. How do you see Afghanistan and, by extension, Pakistan in the India-US?
So I'd widen it to also include Pakistan.
Yeah.
One is, of course, the old argument that we know that the US presence in that particular area is going to always keep Pakistan in the game, so to speak. But we also saw in this recent visit by the Pakistani foreign minister, there's an element from the Pakistan side to also re-establish a more stable, stronger partnership with the United States, which will run in parallel with this Sino-Pakistani equation. And they actually openly said it, that Pakistan can be this sort of binder and bridge between these two worlds. They played it in the past, they want to play it again. So I think that's the kind of larger geostrategic picture that India has to recognize, that that is a reality, that you are hoping that you're going to sort of leverage this US partnership to emerge as this preponderant power. I don't think that's quite possible with the way the international setting is going. So you'll have certain benefits with the Indo-US relationship, maybe balancing Chinese power in the Pacific, how far you can go there. We've also seen the limits there. Maybe I'll just add one more point, sort of a more philosophical, that when the Trump administration came, there was this belief in India that as America redefines its place in the world, little more nationalist, little more tougher on its adversaries in Asia, particularly China, that you might be able to benefit from that, both in terms of shifting American capital enterprise into South Asia, also geopolitically. We've seen actually that that's not played out to what you would envisage, because the globalized economic system, actually now China is an important second pillar in that. You want stability on that front, but even on geopolitics, have you really been able to benefit on the BRI, CPEC? What have you really gained in that sense? So maybe we should be hoping for a more stable US role in the international system rather than this more sort of, because we're hoping that this might lead to a United States that accepts multipolarity. We're actually not seeing that. We're seeing this schizophrenic sort of struggle within the US establishment for prolonging its old policy of primacy versus something which is a little more destabilizing, that if we can't have our way, we're going to retreat but in a way that doesn't solve conflicts, that exasperates them. So we're seeing it in Iran, we're seeing it in West Asia. Even in East Asia, we haven't really seen anything constructive on the Korean Peninsula. So it's a complicated
Can I sort of extend this to you, and really one of the fundamental kind of contradictions which we've often said for 20 years, if not more, going back to Prime Minister Narasimha Rao's tenure to where we are now, that when it comes to Pakistan, India and the United States are on different pages, meaning that we have a certain view of Pakistan as a country that has been sponsoring terrorism and all those connotations, whereas the United States, even despite all the kind of, shall we say, revelations about the perfidy of the Pakistani state in relation to terrorism, Taliban supporting, US troops have died, let's put it as bluntly as possible. So how do you see the Pakistan factor in the India-US bilateral?
Before referring to, I have just one point. You talked about India being democracy and we say a value with USA. This is one factor, but if you look around, some of the closest allies of US have no democracy. The democracy being a very factor is a very myth, because you are really wanting to be close to India for last so many years.
But those countries do something very differently.
I will just, China, if there was no China factor,
China also
USA, whether it's Obama, whether it's Mr. Trump, they see India could be only counterweight to China.
But I'll tell you, I think I'll come back on that. But do you want to talk on Pakistan?
Pakistan, we can never be on the same page, because US need of Pakistan and US need of India are two different things. They can never, fact, when all these people, whether you go to Hillary Clinton and he said your bidding stake will come to you also, the same. Trump has put maximum possible pressure on Pakistan. At the same time, they knew they cannot do without Pakistan, Afghanistan. Somebody wrote in, I think recently, some paper in USA saying, here logistics are overshadowing the strategic interest, because you just cannot avoid Pakistan. They are really begging literally for last 2 years to have discussion with Taliban, whom they unseated 2002. But they can't do without Pakistan. Now some reports are saying they might meet maybe this month or other. And so long as they cannot exit from Afghanistan gracefully, US cannot, there is no way US can abandon Pakistan, but we should be happy. They are really showing flexibility. After all, we couldn't have put Masood Azhar without American pressure. China was obstructing for so long, but they finally agreed. And they have really been openly saying you have all these terrorist camp, training camp, all the closed now, but there are limitations to their capability of controlling Pakistan, because Pakistan is still in a position to damage their interests of Afghanistan.
So we live with the contradiction. Yeah. But I just want to make one point on this democracy issue, which is that it may be true that the United States has a close relationship with a number of countries that are not democracies, but that in no way, I think, detracts from the fact that when we go back to 2008, much of the foundation was that India was being acknowledged and recognized for its democratic secular credentials. And there is disappointment within the US, but we'll leave that aside. Tanvi, I want to actually come back to you on the China factor. Two issues here. One is China-Pakistan. I mean, as recently as 10 days ago, we had China raising the Kashmir issue again in the United Nations Security Council. Now we have President Xi Jinping in Myanmar, Pakistan, and the whole BRI, and the footprint is getting, deeper and stronger. So since you've written a book on the subject, maybe you should give us a little policy prescription how China is playing out in the India-US.
Sure. So my book is more historic, and it makes the argument that while we see this idea of China shaping US-India relations today, that it has done so in the past in the Cold War, and what lessons can we learn. And I think one of the things you do see even today, and this is where I see things slightly differently from Zorawar, which is that if you think about what India has gained from this kind of geopolitical or seeing China differently, for one, it's related to our conversation about Pakistan. You would have seen a far more critical US about what's happening in India domestically, including on the economy, had the US not thought it needed India because of its concerns about China. You would have seen the US not be forthcoming with assistance at the Financial Action Task Force or the UN Security Council, had it not felt the need to establish a relationship with India. You'd have seen far more complaints about the Modi government not having signed a big defense deal with the US so far. We might see it during a potential Trump visit. But I think China in some ways has created space or concerns about China where there is convergence between the US and India. You've seen that create space at a time when those economic links and the values links aren't as big a driver for the relationship. The US is not going to solve all India's China problems. But what it has done is, it's a question of what you do with the partnership. And not just with the US. So for India, it's been one of the outcomes we've seen is India, as historically, it's always been concerned about other countries acting its neighborhood, other powers. But whenever China's been the one getting involved, it's more than happy to work with other countries, including the US, including Japan. And now potentially we might see it with countries like Australia. But so I think we've seen the US in some ways, there are often complaints here that, US is going to try to use India as a frontline state. I would argue India has been doing that far more with the US, which is trying to bring the US in terms of funding. And now there are $60 billion worth of funds, not necessarily just in the Indo-Pacific, that the US will bring to the development finance picture. You've seen, and you would know this better than me, the upgrading of India's maritime capabilities because of technology being available from the US that wasn't earlier. In large part thanks to their concerns about China. So I think, the US is not going to do everything for India, just the same way India won't do it for the US. But it's that convergence, I think, that has created space, not just for India with the US, but I would argue for India with China. You would not have seen Xi Jinping come to the table in Wuhan had it not been for both Chinese concerns about US and India knowing that China was concerned about the US.
You want to comment on this, Zorawar? Because your EPW piece actually talks about the Indian dilemma. You want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, so I think the argument that I've made recently is that the logic for the Indo-US relationship actually becomes more sustainable when you go beyond China, when you broaden the basis of it, when, as Tanvi said and others, that bring the economy and bring regional security and bring also just that idea of a broader balance of power in Asia. But when you come and make China sort of a little more exaggerated in its impact on the Indo-US, you actually then start coming to a situation where India can never play the role that perhaps US geostrategists would like it to play, and perhaps the US can't play the role that India would like it on a continental front as a counterbalancer. So the argument is, and there's of course the bigger picture, which is quite unique, that the rising power in Asia, and perhaps in the international system, has these extraordinary linkages with the erstwhile dominant power. So I think that we haven't faced this situation historically where the power transition is happening at a time of intense interdependence. Now, when you see that particular reality, how are you going to exploit that balance of power? So I think on our part, we haven't been as sophisticated. I would say that American policymakers recognize the broader chessboard. My argument is that we aren't recognizing that chessboard. So recognize it and then draw benefits from both sides. That's the argument.
As always, I think, we come to a very interesting point in the discussion just when we're running out of time. But I think the sort of central element here is that for India, the bilateral with the United States would perhaps be amongst the most important over the next 2 or 3 decades. And by extension, I think the challenge for India would be to find the right kind of modus vivendi, if you will, in terms of its relationship with China also. And this really is the critical triangle, which is India, US, and China. And if India is to realize this aspiration of a $5 trillion GDP, because everything starts from a strong economy, I think we would need to fine-tune this engagement both with the United States and with China. But on that note, allow me to thank my guests, Ambassador Kumar, Dr. Zorawar, and Dr. Tanvi Madan. I hope we can have you again and extend this conversation. On that note, thank you very much. We'll come back again with another episode of SAM Conversations.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on the current and the future state of India-US relations as a part of this conversation. Let me begin by stating you have 3 outstanding individuals on the panel for this conversation who I know will provide significant insight on the relations. I'll provide my perspective not as a subject matter expert, but as an Indian American who has developed an understanding of the way both nations work, and as a person who wants to see relations that are beneficial to the best interests of the 2 countries I dearly love. That said, I believe, as President Obama stated in 2010, that the India-US relationship has the potential to become one of the defining partnerships of the 21st century. Where do we stand today in that regard? How did we get there? And where are we headed? As I view it, there has been 3 stages to US-India relations to date. The fledgling relationship, which ran from 1947 through 1990. The strengthening relationship, which ran from 1991 through 2016. And the functional relationship, which began in 2017 and will run through 2020. I believe that the future stage will be a strategic partnership. It will start sometime in the period between 2021 and 2030. I'm not going to detail on those early stages because of time constraints. I will say, though, that the US presidents have had a central role to play in the manner in which US-India relations have evolved and will continue to do so. President Eisenhower really began moving the fledgling relationship forward with his visit to India over 60 years ago in 1959. President Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama were pivotal to establishing and maintaining this strengthening relationship, which ran from 1991 through 2016. And President Trump is responsible for the functional relationship that exists today between India and the United States. President Trump took office on January 20th, 2017. There were high hopes from some the US-India relation would strengthen substantially under his presidency. In point of fact, they have not. They have gone one step forward and one step back. The results have been mixed, and the relations have become primarily functional. In my opinion, that's the best that can be expected from this president. Partnership, cooperation, and collaborations are not words in his vocabulary. Nationalism, isolationism, and protectionism are. This is most true when it comes to trade relations and negotiation. For the first 2 years of the Trump administration, India got by relatively unscathed compared to many other nations. Then, in the first half of 2019, things become unhinged as relations were strained and India and the US got into a tit-for-tat tariff war after the US terminated India's Generalized System of Preferences, which is also known as GPS, which allowed India to sell certain imports to the United States duty-free. From mid-year, there was rumor after rumor that a new trade deal will be announced soon. It is now 2020, and it appears a trade deal will be announced shortly. The deal could be announced during Trump's visit to India in February if that occurs. And there could be other important announcements at that time regarding Afghanistan and other defense and security matters central to India-US relations. This would definitely advance the US-India relationship. The relationship will not become a strategic one, however, that is probably due to the fact that such a relationship is contrary to President Trump's modus operandi and personal style. It is impossible to have a strategic bilateral relation with someone who is unilateralist. As I said at the outset of my remarks, however, I do believe that India-US will have a strategic partnership in the future. It will come after President Trump is no longer in the office. If Trump loses his 2020 re-election bid, that partnership could start being developed as soon as 2021. If he wins, he will not start developing until 2024. The reason that such a partnership is likely, there are many driving factors that will eventually bring it about. The primary ones include shared democratic values and common geopolitical interest, expanding trade and commerce, the growing influence of Indian Americans in the United States. As I close my remark, let me say this. President Dwight D. Eisenhower was a visionary. Speaking to India's parliament in 1959, he stated that the welfare of India and the United States were linked together. The prospect and potential that envisioned for an alliance between India and the United States is being realized. There is still quite a way to go to achieve it fully, and there's no guarantee it will happen because the future is promised to no one. The recent events in India related to its treatment of Muslims and minorities, and in the segment of American society which looks inward and backward to more segregated times, could potentially derail the movement towards a strategic partnership between the United States and India. Nonetheless, the journey has begun. I'm optimistic about what it leads.